this month, the United States promised to send cluster munitions to Ukraine for the embattled country to use against Russia. That's part of an $800 million aid package that includes armored vehicles as well as munitions for several systems, including Patriot air defense, HIMARS, and badly needed 155mm artillery rounds.
By providing Ukraine with DPICM artillery ammunition, we will ensure that the Ukrainian military has sufficient artillery ammunition for many months to come. In this period, the United States, our allies and partners, will continue to ramp up our defense industrial bases to support Ukraine.
What DPICMs bring to a battlefield is anti-armor and anti-personnel capability. So essentially, it can be either loaded with shape charges, which are armor penetrating, or they can be loaded with fragmentary munitions, which are anti-personnel. So clearly a capability that would be useful in any type of offensive operations.
Instead of hitting individual people or vehicles, these bombs cover a wide swath of land. The advantage comes when the bomblets explode, and the major risk comes when the bomblets don't explode. The fear is that those munitions that don't explode will function like landmines and cause risk for people for decades to come. Some systems have been used in the past that have a dud rate of more than 40%. That's according to the International Committee of the Red Cross. The Pentagon hasn't said how much of this ammunition will be sent, but it did say that they will have a dud rate of less than 2.35%.
I will say that we have multiple variants of DPICMs in our stocks, and the ones that we are considering providing would not include older variants with dud rates that are higher than 2.35%. We are aware of reports out there from several decades ago that indicate that certain 155mm DPICMs have higher dud rates, so we would be carefully selecting rounds with lower dud rates for which we have recent testing data.
In accepting the munitions, Ukraine has decided the benefits outweigh the risk. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan explained the risk analysis the White House took into consideration.
We have been looking at this for quite some time, and what we have been weighing is this basic question of civilian harm. The challenge of cluster munitions, as you know, is that even at low dud rates, there are some unexploded ordnance that is left, and that could potentially pose a risk to civilians down the road. So we did not immediately come out of the gate and provide this. But we had to balance that against the risk to civilian harm if Ukraine did not have sufficient artillery.
This decision has been met with opposition. The United Nations asked that the use of munitions should, quote unquote, stop immediately. And several countries who are part of the Convention on Cluster Munitions have opposed the White House's move. And those include Spain, Canada, the United Kingdom, China, and Germany. The Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen has warned against using them, and he added that the munitions have maimed or killed people in his country for more than 5 decades, and that the real victims will be Ukrainian civilians. Interestingly enough, Cambodia is not a member of the convention. And another country opposing their use is, you guessed it, Russia. They called it an act of desperation despite using the munitions themselves.
I would note that the Russians have already been employing cluster munitions on the battlefield, many with which include a very high dud rate, reportedly.
Cluster munitions are already used in the war in Ukraine by both sides. The difference is that Russia is using cluster munition to attack, to invade Ukraine. Ukraine is using cluster munition to protect itself against an aggressor.
The U.S. is sending these munitions for another reason beyond strategy, and it's logistics. The administration has been sending 155mm rounds to Ukraine as long as it's been giving aid.
We are reaching a point in this conflict because of the dramatically high expenditure rates of artillery by Ukraine and by Russia, where we need to build a bridge from where we are today to when we have enough monthly production of unitary rounds, that unitary rounds alone will suffice to give Ukraine what it needs. So as a result, this is the moment to begin the construction of that bridge so that there isn't any period over this summer or heading into this fall when Ukraine is short on artillery, and being short on artillery, it is vulnerable to Russian counterattacks that could subjugate more Ukrainian civilians.
The American munitions have a failure rate of less than 2.35%. We're not exactly sure how many rounds are being sent over, but one thing is for certain. These will still pose a risk for people in the future. Included in the agreement to use these are mitigation efforts to reduce the risk of harm to civilians for years to come.
Ukraine has provided written assurances that it is going to use these in a very careful way that is aimed at minimizing any risk to civilians. And by the way, Ukraine, the democratically elected government of Ukraine, has every incentive to minimize risk to civilians because it's their citizens.
The Ukrainian government has offered us assurances in writing on the responsible use of DPICMs, including that they will not use the rounds in civilian-populated urban environments, and that they will record where they use these rounds, which will simplify later demining efforts. Ukraine also has committed to post-conflict demining efforts to mitigate any potential harm to civilians. The United States has already invested more than $95 million in Ukraine's demining activities, and we will provide more support to help Ukraine mitigate the impacts of cluster munition use by both sides in this conflict.
So now, we'll have to wait and see if or how much these munitions help Ukraine. For Defense News Weekly, I'm Daniel Woolfolk.